So we've managed to animate the camera transition for our, when we click on our instrument button, we have this transition, but we still need to animate the transparency of the instrument. So let's take a look at that. If we open up our steel material, we can see that we currently have it transparent. So that'll work well for the start of our range here. So let's go into transparency, and you'll notice each of these attributes have the same sort of square beside it that the render cam coordinates had here. So all of these are keyable. So what I'm going to do is, let's see if we take our brightness all the way down, we can see that our material comes back. So this brightness attribute is what I'm going to actually key. So make sure that we're at frame 1, and I'm going to click, or control click, or command click on a Mac on brightness at 100%, and we can see that we've got this keyed here. So now let's come to our end frame. Just move this out of the way a bit. So we're on frame 48. And actually, sorry, one thing that we also need to do on frame 1 is we need to key our specular attribute. So we have this height that also adds this visible element in our scene. So let's control click on height at 0% so we have a completely transparent material. And fortunately, because we've got our steel material applied to both of the things that we want to make transparent, we only have to do this once. If you had multiple objects that had different materials, or you wanted the transparency to be influenced differently, let's say you wanted the forceps to come up first and then the scalpel, you could make a copy of your steel material and apply one to one and one to the other and key them separately. So we're at frame 48, so let's make this fully opaque. So let's first go to the transparency, drop our brightness down to 0. This little yellow box indicates that our attribute has changed. So let's control click, and you notice it hasn't updated here, but I think that's just because if we so as soon as we change something else, the preview updates. So we're going to bring our height back up to 100%, and notice that this doesn't have to be 100%. In this case, the material was just set at 100%, but if it was at 63, you could key it up to 63. It doesn't really matter. So let's key our specular. So we've got our transparency and specular keyed at 48%, so we can close that. And now let's just see what's happening in our view. So you can see that over time it's becoming more opaque. Now one thing that's good to do, because our viewport here doesn't show us everything, let's just take a quick little test render at the beginning. That looks good. Let's go to the end frame, take another one, and it's good to keep these test renders nice and quick so you can really easily see what's going on. And let's go to frame 24. And you know what? Even though we're middle of the way through, the instruments look relatively opaque. I mean, there's a bit of transparency there, but I think I kind of want less transparency here and have them more come into visibility towards the end of the range. So we're going to open up our timeline once again, and you can see that we also, in addition to our render cam keyed, we also have something else keyed, our steel. So I'm just going to open up the transparency brightness, and I'm just going to ignore specular height because it doesn't have a huge bearing on what's happening over time. It's really the transparency that's driving this effect. So we can see at the beginning we've got 100%, it's our highest value, and at the end we've got 0. So this curve represents how the transparency is dropping over time. So I think what we want is to actually, let's just click on the first key and drag out our tangent handle. And you can see what that's doing is it's giving us a slower fall off at the beginning, and then towards the end there's a steeper drop off, and we actually come into the end. And what we could actually do is just bring up that tangent handle so it's kind of this smooth arc of drop off. Now let's see what that has done to our scene. So let's just go into the middle here, and you can see in the middle it's kind of to my eye, this sort of feels more like a 50% transparency, even though it's less. So I think that'll give us a better result. So we can go even into the middle here, and yeah, it's just starting to come into visibility. And then if we go sort of 3/4 of the way along, and that's a little more opaque, and then right at the end, of course, we're completely opaque. So I think that looks better to my eye. Okay, great. So we've got our transparency and our camera sweep working well for our transition. So remember that we talked about having the initial view, the end view, and the transition. So let's see how we can render each of these elements out to bring them into After Effects. Next, here, all we need to do is go to our first frame, render this, and we can go File, Save As. We're going to do a still image, TIFF. You could also do a JPEG or something else. TIFF will be high quality. Sorry, one thing I'll notice here, we've got 800 by 600, and this might be off the view, but you can see that our size is 800 by 600. So what's happening here is it's using our default render settings, which were specified. So we've got quick render and nice render, both have 1024 by 768, but this my render setting, and we've got the white box here, has the default 800 by 600. So let's just quickly change this to the quick render, and then hopefully when we hit render here, yeah, now we've got the full size of the render out here. So we want to make sure that we've got those dimensions correct. So let's go Save As, 1024 by 768, that's right. And we've got our instrument, viewer, render, and our start frame. So that's good. Okay, so now we can go to our end frame, because for our storyboard we also want to be able to stay at our end frame. Okay, so we've got our end frame here, so we'll do Save As, and let's call this end. Okay, great. So we've got our start and our end frame out, but how do we get this nice animated transition? Well, we can get that in the render settings. So in the output tab here, we can see we have the frame range, and it's set to current frame. That's just going to output one frame. So we can go manual and go from frame 1 to frame 48. And you notice something strange here. It says frames 59 from 1 to 60, but that's not what we put. We said 1 to 48. And that's because we've got the frame rate here is default to 30. And remember, we changed the frame rate to 24 frames per second. So we want to change this as well to 24. So now we've got 48 frames from 1 to 48. And that'll work well. We can go to our save, and we can actually specify the path that's going to render out to each of the frames too. There's an important distinction between rendering out a movie and rendering out individual frames, and it's actually better practice to render out individual frames, because if your render crashes halfway through rendering out a full movie, you don't have anything. But if your render crashes halfway through rendering out individual image files as frames, you've got all of the frames up until the crash, and then you can carry on from there. Or if you wanted to go back and render out just a section of that, you can do those individual frames as well. So I'm going to call this instrument viewer transition, and instrument viewer transition, and that's going to add the name and a number of zeros and .tiff to the end. We only really need 3 zeros. We actually technically only need 2 zeros, but that will work for us. We don't need to include sound. There's no sound. And I think that should be good. And we're just going to go render, add to render queue. And when it says, do you want to save the changes to the project, actually we need to hit yes, because if not, it'll only take the render settings, I believe, that were saved from the last time you saved. So it's important to save here. I'm just going to delete that old one because this is our newer render job. So let's just double check here. We've got quick render set, Yes, we've got a render cam is the correct camera that we want to be rendering out. And I think everything else is good to go. So let's just hit Jobs, Start Rendering. And then we've got 1 to 48. These are the frames that it's rendering out. You can see the current frame, elapsed time, etc., and even a little preview of what's happening in the renders. So I'm just going to pause here and I'll be back once it's done rendering. Okay, so our rendering is completed here. So let's just take a look at what we've got. We've got, first of all, our start and end, and then we've got a series of 48 individual images. Let's bring it over here, and if we just click through them really quickly, we can see that it's representing our animated sequence. So that looks great. So that brings us to the end of our Cinema 4D portion of the tutorial. In the next lesson, we're going to look at our 2D assets from Illustrator and then start bringing them into After Effects to put everything together. So thanks for watching this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.